I'm in Harbin today and I'm visiting quite a difficult place to visit. I hesitated about doing a video about this for quite a long time because I think it's not your typical tourist vlog or somewhere that you go looking to have a good time. So I'm here at the Unit 731 Museum in Harbin. The official name, which might give you a better idea of exactly what took place here, is the Evidence of Crimes Committed by Unit 731 War Museum. So I'm going to have a look around and hopefully learn a little bit more about exactly what took place here, because I think it's important to learn. So for those that don't know or have never heard of this place, Unit 731 was effectively a biological warfare research center that was set up in Harbin in 1935, a couple of years after the Japanese occupation of Harbin and the Manchuria area, which was in 1931. So in 1935, this research center was set up effectively to test biological weapons on human subjects. And I think for me, learning a little bit more about this, one thing that strikes me right away is that this wasn't, your a ragtag group of offshoot scientists who, couldn't succeed in their careers and wanted to do some very extreme research to get famous or anything like that. This was straight from the top down. So this was a very, very organized institute which effectively reported directly back to the Japanese government and back to the emperor about the research that they were carrying out here. And it was done by some of the Japanese top scientists, so scientists who held PhDs in various scientific fields and were some of the smartest scientists that Japan had to offer. This was not just an amateur operation. This was huge, incredibly thorough and horrific human research. So the museum is split into various parts that explain the history of the biological warfare experiments that took place here. The first part effectively in how it was set up, and the second part a lot more about some of the detailed experiments they did. And when we talk about the experiments that took place here, this was on a level of atrocity that I think is incomparable to nearly anything else. This was sheer lack of any care or emotion for the subjects. This was simply treating the subjects as animals so that they could perform efficient research. At the height of its operations, the research facility employed nearly 3,500 staff who were involved in all kinds of experimentation. The major part of the experimentation still being on biological warfare, which encompassed exposing people to diseases such as the plague, typhoid, and other even sexually transmitted diseases such as syphilis, and studying the human reaction to that. And when I say studying, this was incredibly dark stuff. So they would administer patients with food or drink or simply inject them with these diseases and then measure the patient's reaction to these diseases, how they were affected, how long it took them to die. In some cases, they would even perform live vivisection, so they would cut the patients up while they were alive to see how their internal organs had been affected by the disease. It was truly the most horrific research you could imagine. Adding to the sense of precision that I mentioned, that all this was carried out with a sense of professionalism, as horrific as it was the insane confidentiality measures that they had in place. This research was world leading at the time because nobody else was barbaric enough to consider doing this kind of research. So that meant that there were incredibly strict confidentiality measures in place all throughout the facility. To the general public, the Unit 731 headquarters posed itself, in fact, as a lumber camp, and this even became an in-joke with the staff, that they would name the patients as a Japanese term that effectively meant chopped wood to be used. I think one thing that really struck me as well is how much they made an effort to take care of themselves while they were performing such barbaric experiments on the victims here. So one thing that the museum has on display is some of the menus that they would eat and some of the various equipment that they had with them. And these menus included things like coffee and fresh fruit, stuff that while we might think is common to have today, at that time, especially in wartime, were incredible luxuries. And the budget that they had in this facility was insane. They had the full support of the Japanese government and the emperor himself. So this next part of the museum, and perhaps the main focus of what the research center was about, is the human experimentation. The major aim of this research laboratory was to understand more about bacterial research and bacteria that might be used as part of biological warfare. So they did tests with various diseases including cholera, dysentery, typhoid, anthrax, and the plague. And they eventually settled on the plague being the most powerful potential disease that could be used as biological weapon. So the research would expose victims to the plague and test how quickly they died, how easily they infected other victims, and exactly what the mortality rate and the symptoms of this was. Ultimately, one of the reasons that they chose the plague was that it had a 100% mortality rate, and the patient died often within 24 hours. As well as researching the damage that these various diseases could do, they needed a way to weaponize them. And so this research center put a lot of focus on carriers of disease. They did huge amounts of research on various different animals, including mice and rats and squirrels and fleas, and even various farm animals, such as cows and pigs and donkeys too. And through their research, the Japanese heads of this place decided that fleas were the most efficient carrier. And so the next step was to start developing bombs or ways to spread plague-infested fleas. This museum has gone to painstaking lengths to collect huge amounts of evidence and reports from this time and the research that was taken out here. So you can see all around me, the walls are littered with medical reports, are incredibly thorough and incredibly callous in the way that they are written, with the subjects being depicted as animals or entirely inhumane subjects. You might notice that all of these reports gathered by the museum are actually in English, not in Japanese. So there's a very good reason for that I will explain later. Behind me now, there are bricks. You might be thinking, why are there a bunch of old bricks on display here? And that also is for a very good reason, in that these are the leftovers of the incinerators that were used. So when they needed to dispose of patients or evidence, as they did later on, the Japanese researchers here would use these incinerators and burn everything. And while the bacterial research was the main focus here, these researchers took advantage of having live human subjects pretty much as they could. They carried out plenty of other inhumane tests, one of which included tying prisoners to crosses at various different distances away from a grenade, and also wearing various different clothing, some with armor and no helmet, some with no armor, some with helmet and no armor, some a couple of meters away from the grenade, some 10, 20 meters away. And this was all because they wanted to understand how to treat wounded Japanese soldiers from shrapnel injuries. So they would put a grenade down and set it off, and then simply just measure what had happened to the prisoners that were strapped to the crosses. I remember before I came here, I actually did a little bit of research just to get an idea of what I was getting myself into by coming and understanding the atrocities that took place here. And one of the things that struck me the most was partly a research that was not in fact the bacterial research, but was a frostbite experiment. So as you know, Harbin is very far north in China with an incredibly cold climate, temperatures that can get up to minus 25, 30 in winter. And the researchers use these to test the effects of frostbite on their patients. And they would force these people outside, sometimes naked, sometimes just wearing one layer of clothing, and force them to stay in a confined area to test, for example, how long the frostbite took, where the frostbite started, how long it took before it became lethal, and how various different diets might affect the intake of frostbite. Was there any particular diet that they fed the subjects that helped them against frostbite? Things like this, that they seem to be completely just unaware of the fact that they were testing on live humans. Well, not unaware, because I think that's the wrong word. They simply just were, there was a sense of apathy, I think. One of the things that struck me the most was that there was no limit here. So anything that they thought of that they wanted to research, they did. There was systematic rape that took place at this research center, where they would rape and in fact impregnate a lot of the female detainees, and these then became a separate subject to be studied on. So they would study on pregnant women and how various illnesses or afflictions would affect their unborn baby, and they would even study on newborn babies. There was one particularly horrific case of a 3-day-old baby being afflicted with frostbite, just so the researcher could test how babies reacted to frostbite. So, as they wanted to dehumanize their subjects here, the Japanese came up with the word maoru, which I believe effectively just means a piece of wood. And this was how they referred to their detainees. So this part of the museum goes into great length to explain what kinds of patients and what kinds of detainees ended up in the Unit 731 headquarters. So the overall breakdown was about 70% Chinese, and the other 30% were mostly Russian, but there were also a few Mongolian and Korean prisoners. Unit 731 headquarters was effectively a prison at first. So this was somewhere where detainees could be taken. And one of the larger sources were the anti-Japanese resistance. So people who'd been accused of being a member or had been found to be part of the anti-Japanese resistance in Manchuria would be taken here. So it's estimated that up to 15,000 people died in this one research center, including many prisoners dying of the various illnesses, people starving to death, and various other horrific illnesses and injuries that were purposefully inflicted on these research victims. The Japanese Kempo worked with this research center, and they cooperated in sending all of their political prisoners here. So anyone that had been captured by the Kempo plotting against Japan or committing any so-called anti-Japanese crimes would be captured by the Kempo and then taken here. And as I mentioned, they, through research, decided that the plague would be the most effective disease and that fleas would be the most effective carrier. So their next step was to figure out how to effectively spread fleas infected by the plague. So various research was done on missiles and bombs and different types of weapons that could successfully spread huge numbers of plague-infested fleas into regions. And one of their ideas for biological warfare and how it would be transmitted was this balloon that you can see behind me. There was an idea of a balloon bomb that would carry the bacteria to the designated location. And this was a plan that the Japanese actually started to put into motion in 1945. They planned to use this balloon bomb in the war against the US, but they actually surrendered before it was put into use. I think what is interesting is that biological weapons were so horrific that even the Japanese themselves weren't willing to use them sometimes. So prior to the balloon bomb being planned in 1945, there were other plans in 1944 to spread plague to the west coast of the US that the Unit 731 head supported and wanted to go ahead with, but these were actually rejected by the Japanese Chief of Staff, who I believe said something like, if we launch a biological weapon attack on the US, then we're no longer fighting a war between Japan and the US. We're fighting a war between the bacteria and the entire world. So they clearly knew that this was something that was incredibly inhumane and that they actually weren't even willing to use themselves sometimes. But the research was happening nonetheless. In fact, the biological warfare that they had researched was actually put into place in China. So in areas of China that were still not occupied by Japan, they conducted biological warfare by dropping huge amounts of plague-infested fleas into regions in China, including Ningbo and Chengde and Chuzhou. As a result of this biological warfare, it's estimated that over 300,000 people lost their lives. Of course, this is incredibly hard to estimate. It could easily be a lot more, because if you're thinking of the amount of peasants that would be affected at that time, the rural population in these counties, these were highly infectious diseases that were spread meticulously into the water systems, into the irrigation systems, into the farming systems, and they ensured that the local population would be infected to a higher extent as possible. So you might think, well, why have I never heard of any of this? And part of the reason that this was also hushed up for such a long time after the war was because a lot of the head researchers here at this laboratory actually joined the US on immunity deals. So they handed over their research to the US, and some of them actually carried out further research in the US, and for this they were given full immunity for the hideous war crimes that they had committed. So in August 1945, obviously 2 bombs were dropped on Japan and the war was coming to an end. So the Japanese researchers here, they ordered all of the remaining prisoners to kill themselves, to hang themselves, in fact. A quarter of the prisoners did so. The other 75% refused and were killed by the Japanese researchers. not a single prisoner was left alive. There were no surviving prisoners of the Unit 731 camps. As the war was coming to an end, the researchers knew they needed to get out, and so they fled Harbin on the 11th of August 1945 and took a train through Korea and then a boat back to Japan. And I think one of the most painful things for people visiting here, especially for those that had relatives and family, older generations who suffered in Harbin or in other areas of China because of the biological warfare that was researched here in Harbin. For those people, it's incredibly difficult to see that the majority of these Japanese researchers were able to go on and live very comfortable lives. Here behind me, you can actually see the museum has gone to painstaking lengths to discover the fate of many of the researchers of this laboratory. So you can see that nearly all of these researchers went on to live very privileged lives in Japan. They became university professors, they opened pharmaceutical companies, or they continued doing various medical research in Japan. So I've come to the end of my visit here, and it's been a difficult place to visit. I think learning about the atrocities that took place here, and then at the end of the exhibition, learning that nearly all of these researchers went on to live very rich, comfortable, privileged lives, is a difficult thing to hear. And it doesn't feel nice. But at the same time, I think this is somewhere that's very important to visit if you come to Harbin. I know when people think about being a tourist and visiting somewhere, you want to go somewhere that'll make you relax, somewhere where you can be happy, and this certainly isn't a place for that. You shouldn't be leaving here feeling happy, but that's not the point. I think this is vital history that needs to be remembered. The lives that were lost here and the horrific atrocities that took place here, they have to be remembered so that they can be avoided and not repeated in the future. And I think coming here, it's given me a good understanding of just how much China suffered during World War II, because that's not something that we learn a lot about in Europe. Obviously, we learn a lot about World War II itself in our history classes, but in schools, the history is always going to be affected by your geography. So we learn about what takes place in Europe and what impacts the United Kingdom, but we learn very little of what happened to China and how China suffered in this period. So for me to learn about somewhere like this and to find about just the sheer scale of war crimes and atrocities that are taking place in somewhere like this, I think it's very important to learn about, as unpleasant as it is. And I think the museum itself has done a fantastic job of the curation. It's designed as a black box symbolically, because like a black box that relays the information of what happened in an aircraft, they want to relay the information of what happened here. They don't want the history to be lost. And there's painstaking efforts that have been done, including many visits to Japan that I heard from the staff here, in just trying to get a lot more of an understanding of what took place here. Because obviously, as I mentioned, in 1945, the staff fled this place. And when they fled, they destroyed all the evidence. So they burned all of the documents, they burned all of their research that they couldn't take with them, they disposed of as much of the bacteria as they could, and they didn't leave a lot. So to create a museum about somewhere as top secret as this, when the perpetrators themselves had disposed of the evidence, is not an easy task. I would like to thank the Harbin government, and I think the museum organizer for being able to put the effort in to set this up, to make sure that we don't forget what's happened here, because they've gone to huge efforts to make sure that this story is told. And that, I think, is why I decided that I should still make this video, despite it being such a difficult and sensitive topic.